Hello, I hope you are doing great. Today we are going to talk a little bit about React. We are going to learn React.js. React is basically another JavaScript framework that allows us to create, let's say, single page applications, right? Just like Angular exists, we have other frameworks such as React, Boo. Well, now we have Blazor, right? We have a lot of those. Now, we are going to do it in two steps. Um, the first thing we are going to do is we are going to create a small application with Visual Studio, right? Just so we can see it, and then we will go to the documentation, right? So we'll see the default template in Visual Studio. We'll try to figure out what it is doing, and then we will go to the actual website for React and read a little bit of the documentation, right? It depends the best way, the way you want to learn. I'm not an expert. Actually, I know very little of React. When it first came out, uh, I saw it and I didn't like it because of the mix of JavaScript functions with HTML, right? I honestly have always believed that you must have your UI definition totally separate from your code, right? So we'll see a little bit what I mean. And then we will try to go deeper using the documentation. Okay, so if you want to create a React application using Visual Studio, you will go to create a new project and you will choose the ASP.NET Core with React.js template, right? When you finish that, you will have a project with a structure like this, right? So in Visual Studio, remember that we have the program.cs. The program.cs basically has the startup or the starting logic for the application, right? Then it configures the builder to use the startup. The startup, it has all of the configuration, the services, right? All that is required. It adds the support for the single page application static files, very important. And it says, or it configures the actual root path for the SPA files. Basically, um, client app build is when those are the files that um, are going to be used when the application is running, right? Then we have the configure, right? And here we have, okay, use the static files, right? We enable static files in there. The rest is just normal logic for configuring the routing and the endpoints. And here we configure the use SPA. We said that the source path is going to be a client app. And if we are in a development environment, we are going to use the React development server and we pass the npm script. So npm script basically is start and that's what it's going to use now. Now that's basic template for most uh, SPA applications when using a .NET application, right? That's going to launch the SPA application, right? Um, the rest is just .NET Core, right? Controllers and pages. There is nothing different from a normal .NET application, right? Now we have the client app. The SPA's applications usually will have a client directory named client app. That's kind of a standard. And on the client app, you will basically have your pretty much all the files that will be executed on the browser. Okay, so now we see that in here we have, okay, the readme. I'm not going to read this. It's really big, right? So I'm not going to read it in here. So it just tells you pretty much how to use it, the documentation, right? Some of the commands that you could use, right, etc., etc., etc. And the folder structure pretty much explains everything. You have the .env. I believe those are for environment variables. I don't know what they are setting this, so it's probably something to research. We have the package.json, which we are going to see in some moment. Then we have the public folder where we have the icon, right, the index.html, and the manifest.json. Manifest, as far as I know, is pretty much the um, application definition, right? Like the metadata index, like that, I guess. And the index.html. Now, usually when you execute a web application, the first and you load the root, usually, I'm sorry, usually what the server is going to look is for a file name index.html, 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 default.html. I believe there were a couple of others that are actually searched by default. So we know that this index.html is actually probably going to be the main, or actually the default document that is going to be loaded when you start the application, and it actually is. Now, see, we have, this is an HTML5 document. We have the basic definition for the lang. We have the head. The interesting thing that you will see in here, there are a couple of things. You have the public URL, which this is actually going to be substitute on build, I think. Yeah, these are pretty much just placeholders to be substitute, and I believe they are substitute on build. Um, then we have this. Well, it says when a script, right? You need to enable JavaScript to run this app, and you have a div with the ID root. This ID is really important. We will see why in a second, right? And then you just have some um, comments, right? Now, contrary to applications such as Angular or Blazor, where you usually have here a lot of scripts being imported, this one does not have it, right? So how do we know how this ID or this div is going to be turned in the actual React application? Remember that usually on SPA applications, you will have a div with an ID or some selector specific name that is going to be the indicator that your SPA, the indicator for your SPA engine to render and to load inside that container or div, right? So in here you will see that in source we have a couple set of files, right? One of the things we have is this index.html, and then we have the app.js. Now you see this index.html. It has some imports, right? And this actually seems, it actually is a JavaScript file. See, the extension is .js. It's importing a couple of libraries, right? So we are importing bootstrap.css, React from React, React DOM from React-DOM, browser router from React-router-DOM. This is similar to what you do in Angular, actually, that you have in your components, you basically import um, the objects and the components whatever you need to use in that component where you are coding, right? Or in your model or wherever you need it. Okay, we have a couple of constants. See this base URL, it actually gets it from the document. It gets something named base, and you get the attribute ref, right? And the root element, it's going to get something named root. That's why I mentioned that the root name or the ID was really important, because this root is what is going to be, it's basically, this is basically going to search for an element that has that specific ID. So it will iterate through the document, look if there is um, something with ID equals root. It is. So this root element, it's going to be this div, right? And then it invokes a function from the React DOM class, I guess, render, and it tells that it's going to render this application, and this probably is the configuration for the base router, I guess, and see that it says render as the parameter. It gets this, right? So browser router base name, that's the base URL, which is the one we got, and inside this we set app. So basically what it is doing, it's saying, okay, you, the you app component, which is this, I believe is a component, I don't know how to call it actually, is the application. um, this, it's going to be rendered in this root element, right? There is where your application is going to be executed. That's going to be the container for your whole SPA application, right? And then it registers the service worker in case you are working with service workers. Okay, that's what I think so far from what I have seen, right? Now we are going to the app.js, and here we see that we are importing React, a component from React, the router, the layout from layout, the home component, the fetch data component, and the counter component, as well as the custom.cs. Now we create a class named app, which is going to extend a component. Yeah, indeed, the app is a component. We have some variables in there that we are probably going to use somewhere. So yeah, static display name equals app dot name. I guess it will get it from, I don't know, the title or the manifest. It probably gets it from the manifest, I guess. Actually, we could test that in a second. So we have then the render function or method, I don't know how you will call it in here, and see that we have this return. So this is basically returning the layout, or sorry, this is, as far as I think, configuring the router, right? So saying that when you request this page, the home page, without any um, other part, right, without any specification, you are going to load the home component. When you specify counter, you are going to load the counter component, and when you specify the fetch dash data, you will get the fetch data component, right? Now we have this layout. Let's see what does have the layout. The layout is basically the layout. See, we have this render, and we basically render a div. First thing that we will have inside the div is the navigation menu. Then we will have a container, and this container seems it's going to print all of the children, I guess. I don't know where is this, but my guess is that this will basically get the actual component based on the route. That's what we render, I guess. Okay, so now we go to the home.js, and you see then here we have import React, right? Uh, we import React and the component, right? So home is going to extend from component. Display name is going to be home.name, right? So I guess it's going to print the same name of the class, I guess. Then we have basically some HTML, right? And let's see if we have any code in here. So let's see display name if it is used somewhere else, somewhere in here. It actually doesn't. No, it doesn't seem to be used anywhere in there. So let's go to fetch data. This will have some code. So if we request the fetch data, we have something similar, right? We have the class fetch data, which extends from component, right? We have a variable for display name. We have a constructor, right? Which have the props, which I don't know what they are, right? Need to probably uh, figure out what that is. This state, basically the state, it's going to be this, right? So state is going to have the forecast, and it's going to have a loading flag, right? We have this render. So basically, contents are going to be equal to when loading is set to true, it content is going to be equals to loading. Otherwise, content is going to be equal or will have the value of the result of the render forecast table function to which we are passing the actual forecast in here. So let's see what is the render forecast table. It's basically a function that is created here. We set the variables, right? And we are rendering a table, right? We are rendering the headers, right? And we are iterating through the forecast variable, which is in here, and we are rendering a row with a couple 4 columns, right? So basically forecast, see, we iterate through all of the forecast items. Each individual one is going to be forecast, right? And we can access the individual property in there. And in here, this is actually setting the key for equals to the actual date of that. And probably the date is unique. Uh, so it's kind of an auto-generated ID, but based on the date in the data, right? And component did mount, see, it says call immediately after a component is mounted. Setting a state here will retrigger re-rendering. So, okay, so if the component um, is mounted, I believe this means if the component was successfully loaded, I guess, uh, you can go and start loading the data. So see, start populate weather data. Basically what it does is it fetches the data from this URL, right? This is the response. Then we convert the data to JSON, and then we set the state to forecast equals data, unloading equals false, so it already was already loaded. This is set states probably, oh, it's actually from, probably seems to be from React. It's from React itself, right? So we set the state equals to forecast, right? And this. Then, as far as I understood, um, when you set the state, or when you change the state, the rendering will be retriggered, re retriggered, yeah. So we populated the data, we got information, and then probably the render is going to be executed again. Then fetch data render from here. Uh, this state is going to have that, right? And oh yeah, a state is actually a property probably from or a variable that's probably defined in component. Yeah, here it is, the state variable, right? So basically we set this state, right? It inherits or it's defining component, right? So we set that state in here, right? This is on the constructor. Then when it mounted, we fetch the data. When we fetch the data and everything is successful, it changes the state. It re-renders again. Then the state is going to have the forecast with data. So now it's going to execute this um, this function because there is data, and it will actually render the items in there. Now, a couple of things that I do not like is, for example, something as simple as this. This is a JS file, right? It's JavaScript, and they kind of mix this with HTML. I do not like to do that, right? I am of the preference of having my HTML, my UI stuff in an HTML file, and the rest of the logic, which is programming logic, in my JS file or in my CS file or on my TS file, right? Depending if I am using I don't know, Blazor with C Sharp, Angular with TypeScript, or just JavaScript, right? I'd rather to have the code totally separated from the HTML elements, right? And only have uh, only access or only have coding in the HTML for things like iterate through the items, right? Or um, quick evaluations. If this is this, then render it. Otherwise, do not render it, right? Things like that. And of course, the retrieval of values, right? Like you will do in Angular to bind a model and things like that, right? Um, but this combination, like this, I actually dislike it. Now, the other thing that I do not like is this. If I want to add something as simple as a paragraph in here, see that I have to write it, and it does not give me the closing tag, right? Granted, that is not React. That is because the Visual Studio um, Visual Studio does not support or does not allow uh, or was not designed for HTML combined in your JavaScript functions. I will guess, I will say, right? This is an issue because it is already um, very easy to miss closing a tag in a normal HTML file, right? When you have a lot of stuff in there in a JS file, it's going to be even worse, right? So see, I add in here P, right? I close it and Visual Studio automatically gives me the close tag for that element I was just adding, right? When I have that in my HTML, right? This is just like a cool thing that Visual Studio does, right? But it allows you to reduce errors a little bit, right? So there is one of the things that when I was first testing, I saw that I didn't like to do that, right? The other thing, as I mentioned, is I do not like to have logic mixed um, HTML mix with um, or HTML inside a JavaScript function, let's say, right? And I don't like to have the the actual HTML as part or mix with the JavaScript. Basically, I rather to have two separate files, one for the HTML, right, and another file for the actual coding or the component that is going to be feeding or connected to that actual page, right? So that's the thing. And let's see how it handles the events. So I'm going to close the rest of the files. We are already in the counter.js component, right? So it's basically the same. We import the React stuff from the React library, I guess. We create a class named counter, which extends from component. We create a static variable name display name, which is going to have the value of the counter.name. We create a constructor, which gets these props that we need to figure out what that is. Then we set the state equals to current count equals 0. The increment count there is going to be, or we are going to bind it. Um, okay, so basically what it seems to be doing is, let's see what is this increment counter. This increment counter equals to this increment counter dot bind this counter, increment counter, increment counter. Okay, this one I'm not exactly sure because let's see, this increment counter equals this increment counter, but what I'm thinking here is when this value is initially changed, so it's never null to be able to access line, right? So let's see this increment counter. So yeah, increment counter is probably this. So let's see. Increment counter equals increment counter 2. I'm sorry. Is there any increment counter here? No, I don't think that's going to give me any compilation error, right? With the increment counter, it's basically the name of the method. Yeah. So increment counter basically what it will do is um, change the current count, adding 1 to the count that is actually defined in the state variable, right? And this binding, I guess, is basically say that when this is executed, execute this, right? But I'm not really sure why they do that. Ah, okay, I see why. I think this is a function, right? But here we are not invoking a function. Instead, what we are doing is we are binding the onClick to what you will call something like a delegate, I would say, right? So yeah, basically on click, it's going to use this increment counter, which is actually bound to this, right? So basically it will call this method or function at the end, right? So when we click the button, executes this, right? Change the state, increments the current count in 1, right? Remember that anytime the set state is changed, the page renders again, I think, right? That's what the other method said. And when it renders again, it will basically re-render this. Now, what I'm not sure is if it actually renders everything again or if it only renders the pieces that have values that change, right? Because for example, this will be static, these will be static, most of these will be static except for the actual values. So I'm not entirely sure how that will work, right? And yeah, that's basically like the basis for React, right, in Visual Studio. So in the next video that we are going to do probably next week, we are going to continue about following the React documentation to create the application. It's a game, it's a tic-tac-toe, if I remember correctly, that they are that they have in their documentation for people to learn how to use it, right? I hope this video has been useful. I just wanted to do something different, right? And show you a little bit of the things that why I haven't bothered that much to learn React and it's mostly because I pretty much do not like it, right? But yeah, we will see. It's always good for people to see it and learn a little bit whatever they want, right? Please remember to subscribe, share the videos, invite more people, and also please visit the links in the video description. You can also help keep the videos free by using the links to buy me a coffee and buying the items in my books, right? And yeah, my books and the items that we have in there. You will see in the description how to help